Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Blue Maxima, and I'm here checking out Remnant from the Ashes. Before we get started on this, I just have to thank PlayAsia for supplying me with this copy of the game. If you want to support me, there is a link and a coupon in the description. Use them both, you'll save a little bit of money off your order, and you'll be helping me out in the process. So, with that said, let's go and talk about Remnant. Remnant is a third-person looter shooter with inspiration from the Dark Souls and Destiny games. I know, it's a little bit strange, but we'll get into it. This is actually post-commentary, because the first time I did this video, I wasn't very happy with how the commentary turned out, so we're going to be doing this again. I have 3 hours there as it says, but in the shift tab I just did to the Steam overlay, you were able to see that I have about 6 hours in the game. Well, neither of these are true anymore. I played this for a couple of hours with my mate afterwards, and by a couple of hours, I mean Steam is now showing that I have 11 hours in the game. So, yeah, I can safely say that I've got more than enough for my first impressions. I'm just going through the settings menu here, and everything is about as you would expect. I put everything down to high on this video because as much as I tried, I couldn't keep 120 frames per second on Ultra with everything, and my rig is an 8700K and a 2080, so I shouldn't have too much problem with that on a game like this, but apparently I do, so there you go. I also limited the frame rate to 60 to hopefully prevent it from stuttering too much. Learn that lesson from a medieval. There is also a couple of points in this video where I will stop for a little bit to go and do things like swap out my keyboard, which actually isn't relevant now because I'm doing this in post, but there you go. You can rebind your keys, but there's a few that you can't rebind, which is kind of annoying. 3 audio sliders, which is fine, and a fair selection of languages, so I'm not going to complain too much about any of that, and we're just going to go and load into the game eventually, and then we're going to start. So, the game will start out in Ward 13 every time, which is basically your come back here and buy your shit whenever you're not doing anything sort of place. And I'll be going through in this video anyway, just a quick representation of everything, including upgrading your weapons and armor, buying new weapon mods, and just new weapons in general, really, and stocking up on consumables, whether they be upgrade materials or things like healing items, because the underlying mechanics in this game are actually pretty simple. You have a few status effects that you can get into, but other than that, it's basically just a few consumable items that give you things like health and ammo back, for the most part, so it's not like it really matters that much in the grand scheme of things. I have 2 weapons here, a sniper rifle and a magnum revolver, and I'll be using them for the majority of this video. And that's one of the problems I kind of have with the game, is that the weapons they give you, at least in the beginning, aren't that interesting. Even up to the 12-hour point, it was a little bit hard to impress me personally. I like not so much single-shot weapons, but high-precision weapons, like especially in looter shooter games like this, like magnum revolvers and sniper rifles and battle rifles and stuff like that. And in this game, there's been, like, nothing for me. It's kind of annoying. There's very little in the way of actual weapons to pick up. I've mainly just been picking up tons of useless things like trinkets and stuff like that. There are a few things you can customize on your character. Like, you've got your 2 main weapons, your melee weapon, you've got 2 rings, a charm, and 3 pieces of armor. There are also armor sets that give you bonuses depending on how many you have on at the same time. And there are also defense values that you can upgrade by upgrading at the upgrade guy. There are also things like weapons and stuff like that as well that you can upgrade. And they give you a little boost on everything. It is kind of like Souls in that sense, where you spend your upgrade materials and you get a slight damage buff and you can continuously upgrade. You do also have a Dragon Heart, which is basically your Estus Flask, and you can upgrade that as well. In my current game that I've got in Remnant, that's like 11 hours, I have that up to 6 uses. In this footage, I have it on 4. Unfortunately, it's so slow to use that it's kind of hard to actually get a use in for multiple reasons. We'll understand why shortly. But yeah, you can come to this lady to buy Actually, it occurs to me that the footage is going to be out of sync, so I probably shouldn't talk about anything specific, but, you know, that's a bit of a pain in the ass. The characters on Ward 13 are more or less just talking heads, which is kind of disappointing. In fact, pretty much every character in this game is a talking head. The story in this game, actually, is, at least for the 11 hours or so that I've played, more or less the game being something along the lines of, oh, I can tell you what's going on, but I'm not going to. Go and do shit for me. Which is pretty much the Destiny problem. I'm going to be bringing up Destiny a fair bit in this game because... in this video, I should say, because Destiny seems to have inspired this game a lot, and not in a good way. Especially in relation to the story. Because there is basically no story going on. You washed up on a shore of a place after some kind of apocalypse has desecrated humanity, and you just have to go and try and sort it out. Meanwhile, everyone is basically telling you either A, I can help you but do shit for me, or B, I can't help you but I know someone who can, go do shit for me. And that's basically been the entire loop for 11 or so hours. It's got the Destiny problem where you can't exactly see what's in it for you at any particular time. It's more or less just go and shoot shit. Which would be okay in a few circumstances, but there are a few other things about this game that makes the action generally uninteresting. And again, we'll get to that. You can upgrade your weaponry, as I've talked about before, and I do it in this footage, and you can also do the same thing with your armor, and it requires materials. You get tons of materials after a while, especially early on. Like, I remember playing through the first couple of dungeons and getting tons of iron, which is just the general first level upgrade material. In fact, let's talk about the levels, because I haven't got much else to talk about. So, here's the main idea, the main, like, loop that the game sends you through. You go to the Ward 13 teleport crystal and you teleport to a open world area. Except the open world area usually isn't that open world, it's usually quite linear. You'll end up with entrances to 1 or 2 dungeons, and usually you have to go through one or both. It's never, like, you know, generally if you have a dungeon there is no point to skipping it, because chances are that's where you need to go in the first place. There are also, like, minor enemy encounters and resources to be found around outside, but for the most part, it's basically just a straight shot to whatever dungeon there is to find. Once you have found this dungeon, you go in, and it is a linear path down the dungeon to the end of the dungeon. Sometimes the dungeons split off into 2 paths, which will almost immediately meet back up, and then you will just go straight down the line again. And then once you get out of that, sometimes there will be another open world area, sometimes there will be a boss. I have fought several bosses in this game, and sometimes there will be, like, a special event that happens. And one of the special events I found was a sort of defense mission where you had to defend 2 lizards. And if you kept them both alive, you got a reward for it. But I wasn't able to keep both alive because I suck. So, the thing about the main gameplay loop of Remnant is that it just doesn't remain interesting for multiple reasons. The first reason is that the game's got very little in the way of actual enemy variety. Now, I have played a few different kinds of enemies, right? So, a few different types of enemies, because the game's got several, like, locations that you can visit. The 3 I've been to is a place on Earth, a place that's like a magical space desert, and the third is like a tropical planet where everyone's been taken over by zombie bugs. And for the most part, all of the enemies are kind of the same. Like, there is a dog enemy that appears across all 3 that is pretty much identical in all 3. The majority of the low-level grunts in each area is a sort of dude that will just charge at you flailing an axe. Sometimes they'll throw it at you, and you just kind of have to shoot them a couple of times, or maybe once in the head and they'll go down. There is always a big, bulky dude who'll run straight at you and do, like, a both arms up from the ground sort of attack, and then he'll try and, like, hit you with, like, a hammer or his bone claws or something. Those are the absolute majority of enemies you will fight in this game. There are a couple of unique ones, but they are relatively isolated to particular parts of the game, and you'll miss them as soon as they're gone. it makes the combat pretty uninteresting, especially in places like the dungeons, where they fill the bloody dungeons head to toe with the enemies. I'll get into what re-rolling is in a minute. I need to keep that in mind. But, yeah. When they fill the dungeons head to toe with enemies the way that they do, the combat does not remain interesting. Not even close. Even the more interesting ones, like, enemies that are basically just a walking turret on legs are made less interesting by the fact that you'll usually have to fight them at least 3 or 4 times in a row. It gets really frustrating after a while, especially since the regular stock troopers just stay where they are. Sometimes you get dudes who have guns. Those are interesting, but they're quite rare. Sometimes you get a dude who will fucking shoot to whoop you with a radiation beam. That's also quite rare. Doesn't happen often enough. It means that you have to fight the really boring stuff really often, and it's just dumb, honestly. This is also combined with the fact that despite the fact that the game tries to warn you that you will be needing a lot of ammo, so you should try and conserve as much physical shit as possible. Conserve as much ammo by doing as much melee shit as possible, I should say. You'll end up just wanting to use your guns anyway for 2 reasons. One, there'll be a lot of dudes at any one time getting aggroed to you by like 1 gunshot. And 2, it means that you'll be picking up lots of ammo from their bodies, because enemies drop lots of ammo, especially when you're playing solo. I did play a bunch of this game co-op with a friend of mine, and whoop, that guy just hit himself in the face with his friend in the face with a spear, I should say. But yes, sorry, as I was saying, enemies drop a lot of ammo, so you'll find yourself, unless you're dealing with a situation like where you're surrounded by 4 dudes with guns and you can't afford to go out into the open and charge them, you'll be using your guns a lot more than I think they expect you to. And again, it just makes the combat feel really repetitive, because it's just going to be, you know, stand back from the big bony dude, shoot him, repeatedly, for a long while. And it's just kind of depressing like that. Especially when you have to go back through areas you've already been through. That doesn't happen very much, but when it does, it's an absolute pain in the neck. The game works on the Dark Souls checkpoint system, where you've got your things that'll restore all your healing, your ammo, and it will put you back to full health with no status effects, but it'll also respawn every minor enemy on the map. So you'll find yourself just going through and just sprinting through enemies like that when you do need to backtrack, which is infinitely more annoying. But let's talk about, like, the open world design and the dungeon design, because they're practically the same thing. As I said before, it's either going to be a straight shot, or it's going to be a straight shot, or it's going to be, like, 2 paths split off and then meets up again very quickly after. There's not that much in the way of loot either, which doesn't keep the exploration exciting. Now, there is loot, don't get me wrong, it's just very infrequent. You can find pieces of equipment, but sometimes you'll find equipment that you already have and the game won't want to give you another piece, if you're playing on like someone else's game, for example, and they'll just give you a bunch of money for it. The 2 things that you'll find out in the world a lot are money, which after a certain point basically becomes useless, and scrap, whether it'll be like iron, oh well, scrap is the money, sorry, like iron or forged iron or whatever the other kinds of iron are. You'll also find skill points, which is part of the traits system, but we'll get to that. So you'll find very little in the way of actually exciting upgrades. It's not really helped out by the fact that the game's kind of got a problem with, giving you a lot of trait points, so those don't end up being particularly exciting. And the pieces of equipment, as I said before, some of them can be neat, but you'll go, like, I went like 11 hours only finding like 1 or 2 guns and 1 or 2 pieces of armor. The rest was just trinkets. And after a while, you'll be so full up on trinkets that you'll think to yourself, I really need a better gun. I need something that's more gun-like, not these bloody trinkets that I've already got half a dozen of that I can't use anyway. Especially when it comes to the guns, because as I have found in my experience with this game, interesting guns are few and far between. I don't know if this is a result of me being really unlucky, or if this is a result of just the way the game is designed, because the game is a roguelike. It actually procedurally well, not so much roguelike as in permadeath, but it's got procedural generation, which means that the areas that you see are just randomized every time, right? And for the life of me, I don't like it, for a couple of reasons. One, it doesn't seem to make that much of a difference in the grand scheme of things, because I played one area in my game, and then I went to a friend's game, and I could not tell the difference. Like, a couple of buildings were in a different place, but the bloody map for the overworld looked almost identical, and this was for, like, the second area, the second, like, visual theme of the game. So I found myself thinking, what's the point of the procedural generation if everything's gonna look the bloody same anyway? The story beats also seem to happen on the same thing. The second thing is that the game seems to have something along the lines of campaign re-rolling. I've been told that it isn't actually like a full-on re-roll of your story progression, it's just a re-roll of the existing areas. The game does not tell you this, so you end up in a position where you think to yourself, oh, I don't want to re-roll this because it just seems against the point. The third is that, again, it makes the dungeons overly linear and uninteresting because it always has to be a straight shot. Or a straight shot with a couple of paths that eventually merge back up into a straight shot, which means that all the dungeon layouts feel pretty much identical and they can't really do anything particularly clever with them, except maybe make them go up things like stairs or such every now and again, but they can't do anything truly interesting with the dungeon design because it might break it. Then, apparently it's broken. I am playing this on a sort of like VIP weekend preview build, which is basically the game launching early, more or less. So, I just find myself laughing at the fact that the procedural generation is actually so broken that some people haven't actually been able to finish the game with and they've had to re-roll their campaigns, which is kind of hilarious. But yes, let's talk about the guns. You don't get very many guns in the way of this game because I've been playing for about 11 hours and I've still got the same set of basic weaponry. The majority of weaponry you get is via fighting bosses and using the materials that they drop to build yourself new weaponry. And this means that if you don't like any of the guns they give you, what you particularly get is like few and far between. Guess what? I don't like any of the guns they gave me. I'm the sort of person, as I said before, who likes precision weaponry, but the game seems to really like giving you things like shotguns, there's a grenade launcher in there, and like, I did get this sniper rifle here, but it's actually really bad if you're trying to deal with more than one enemy at once because the reload time on it is shocking, and I eventually just gave up and went back to the bog standard hunting rifle they gave you at the beginning of the game. If you're a fan of like precision shooting and these looter shooters like me, yeah, you're not going to be a particular fan of the way this game does things. This goes double for the boss fights. Now, let me tell you about this game's regular combat before I do that. You've got your two weapons, and you start out with pretty low ammo on both of them, but you've got tons of enemies who all drop ammo for the most part, so you're never going to find yourself running too low on ammo on this part. You also have the ability to sprint and dodge roll, but you are also slower than a wet week, even without sprinting, you're slower than a wet week. With sprinting, you're slower than a wet day, because, man, you feel so sluggish. It's not even because I'm wearing heavier armor in this that actually makes my dodge rolls a bit slower, but even on the lighter weight armor, you're still pretty slow and sluggish, and it's really not great, if I'm being particularly honest. But yeah, you can dodge roll, and you can heal, and healing, of course, takes time that you need to try and isolate from a particular boss fight, or just a particular, well, anything in general, really. you do also have weapon mods, and admittedly this is the most interesting part of the game. Weapon mods can be applied to most weapons. Boss weapons usually have a locked-in weapon mod, and they'll do things like apply burning to your bullets, they'll let you spawn skeletons, they'll let you see every enemy within a 40-meter radius, they'll let you do things like fire off a gigantic arrow that will just do a massive amount of damage and apply bleeding. Just things like that. Those are the most interesting parts of this game, which really helps out because the gunplay, while the guns aren't terrible, but over the course of 11 hours, you really start to feel just the overall repetitiveness of the guns. They aren't so good as to keep that repetitiveness from setting in, which is disappointing in a looter shooter, because yes, this is what you do. I said the game has some Dark Souls inspirations, and this is true when it comes to the bosses, but man, it really does lean heavily on the looter shooter stuff more than it does the Dark Souls stuff. Even like the minor enemies out here aren't that big of a deal because they're pretty easy to deal with once you learn their patterns. They don't provide any like real interesting challenge, it's just learn the patterns and avoid them like a lot of enemies from the Souls series does. But yes, let's talk about the bosses, which are incredibly inspired by Dark Souls. Like, I'm just gonna slot in some footage here of the boss. I'm just gonna write down that I need to put it in around 21:25. Thank you very much, me. So, the bosses in this game, as I said, are very Dark Souls inspired. They have the giant health bar, they have the really punishing attacks, and they have just well, they have one thing that is really, really bad, even by the standards of Dark Souls, and that is enemies. You see, as I said before, enemies drop your ammo, so in order to actively keep supplied up, you need to either be grabbing ammo from them or using the ammo box consumable, which I didn't really need up to the point that I was looking at in this video, so I had already picked up like 7 or 8 ammo boxes lying around the place and not actually used them, just because I was able to source ammo from enemies so frequently. But yes, I found myself not needing that much ammo, but when you get into the bosses, they need a way to drop ammo, and they just didn't think of doing things like, you know, the more damage you do to a boss, the more ammo they drop. So every single enemy boss in this game has a bunch of friends that run around it from time to time for you to shoot and get ammo from. Unfortunately, this makes a lot of the boss combat really, really frustrating to deal with, because you have to be dealing with the enemies more than you have to be dealing with the boss itself, because it will constantly spawn them once you kill them. And it makes it so that you don't really have time to focus on the boss patterns because you're so busy dealing with the enemies. One of the examples from the early game is the Ent, where you are constantly being shot at by it. One of its attacks is to get down on 4 legs and shoot like artillery at you, more or less. But you can't deal with the fact that it's got an exposed weak spot, because at the same time, it's also dropping enemies that you need to run away from, because they will also explode. And you just find yourself constantly running away from it, having no opportunity to actually attack its weak point. This is on solo. I imagine that when you're playing with like more than one player, this might be easier, but even with 2 people, we were having trouble getting to its bloody weak point because we were still being swarmed by all the little dudes that the thing lets out. This is a constant. There are very, very few bosses in this game that aren't constantly letting out little enemies to go and attack you. And even then they get replaced by something else. Like, there is basically a Moonlight Butterfly ripoff in this game, and the Moonlight Butterfly will send out these little blue, what would you call them, balls of energy that will just collide into you and just constantly take damage off. And it's basically as bad as the regular enemies, but even worse, they don't actually drop ammo, so you have to be bringing ammo boxes in. I at least appreciate that they kind of warn you about this by dropping 2 ammo boxes before the fight. But nevertheless. So, your bosses, while they might be interesting, they're just swarming with dudes, and it just makes it a massive pain in the neck to deal with because of that. The enemies are just constantly nipping at your heels, trying to keep you from reloading or healing or just dealing with that. Thankfully, the game is kind of generous in this regard. You can reload not only while you're sprinting, but while you're rolling as well. So, as long as you've got the start the reload animation, you can do as much as you need to while that's going on. But that's just a minor little benefit in comparison to the fact that you're constantly going to be under attack. You're going to have very little opportunity to like actively pull out things like heals, and it's going to piss you off at one point or another. It's not like Dark Souls, where there are very clear points where you can back the fuck up, get a heal in, and try not to be attacked by the boss's next attack. The combination of the enemy AI doing whatever the hell it wants, alongside the boss AI just, you know, getting ready to attack you again, can absolutely screw you. And when you're by yourself, this can be a nightmare, because you have to deal with everything by yourself. At least when you get the enemy down to just by the boss enemy down to by itself, at least that gets slightly interesting, but admittedly none of the bosses have had a particular really fantastic design to me. All of them have just been rather average at best. The only one that I could say is kind of impressive in just its overall design is a boss called the Undying King, but the boss is so fucking Destiny that it was almost distracting. Like, if you look up a boss on this game called the Undying King, it is just, it looks like a cut level from Destiny because it's so generic. Even they thought they were taking the piss. It's so strange, but most of the other bosses you fight just aren't that impressive, and I find myself not particularly looking forward to them. Not because of the fact that they will have annoying attack patterns or anything like that, but the fact that they'll be surrounded by a bunch of enemies they'll have to deal with. At the end of this particular footage, you'll be seeing that, because god damn is it a bit of a pain in the neck to deal with. The overall boss combat is just uninteresting as a result, overall. It goes from being decent to uninteresting just because of how many enemies you have to deal with in the meantime that make it a massive pain in the neck. You'll see it in the... Actually, you would have seen it by now in the boss footage that I've got going on the screen, because it's just... It just becomes too much. It really is. It's also not helped out by the fact that the game's got some technical issues. One of the major issues that we had to deal with was that the game is kind of annoying if you end up dying. If the host ends up dying, which was me in my game, the players who are playing alongside you really should go and kill themselves, because there's a chance that you're not actually going to be able to get the item that you need if they finish the boss for you. So we ended up needing to do an entire boss battle perfectly, because I kept getting my ass knocked off the edge because it was on a narrow platform. Again, hello Moonlight Butterfly knockoff fight. There was this one bug that I ran into where my teammate was constantly on fire, even after resting at the checkpoint. He had to disconnect and reconnect in order to actually make that stop happening. We were just laughing the entire time because we thought it was hilarious, but in a worse situation, that would really bite someone in the ass. I've had a few crashes, so has my friends. Well, my friend, I should say, that's playing this game. The crashes are kind of annoying. And there's also a couple of other things too, like game design decisions that I really do not approve of. Like, for example, story progression doesn't carry over. So, if you want to play this game solo, you'll have to go through some of the same content that you already did in multiplayer. I can understand it in some situations, but, like, the main situation that I played this game multiplayer with was I played with my friend. We played up through part of the campaign that I already did, past stuff that I had already seen, and through, like, a couple of dungeons and a couple of bosses. And then when I went back to my single-player game, I was all the way back at where I was, and I had to play through shit that I already played through. I can understand why this is hard to balance, but at the same time, in a looter shooter like this, where the action is as repetitive as it already is, it can be really frustrating playing through sections of that game like that. Then you've got bloody, what's it called? Damn it, I had my train of thought there. Then you've got some other minor things going on. Like, why can't I sprint in Ward 13, like, infinitely? Because for whatever reason, they make it so that you have to walk around at the speed of a bloody snail in Ward 13, and they still limit your stamina. It seems entirely unnecessary since you don't actually have to fight anything there. That's just one of the little minor things that this game gets wrong. And there's a few other things along those lines that are just like minor details that just end up being infinitely frustrating as a result. And the entire game overall just... well, it just kind of has this problem where you can see some of the things they did in response to something like Dark Souls. And I was hoping for something that was a bit more like that. Instead, I got a relatively generic looter shooter that just isn't that exciting with a couple of Dark Souls tendencies. And that seems to be my major issue with the game. It's the idea that it feels like it's taking a lot from regular old looter shooters when I was hoping for something a bit more inspired by Dark Souls. Instead, you've got a looter shooter where the looting isn't even particularly interesting because of things along the lines of, like, you don't get equipment very often, and sometimes even if you do, if you're in someone else's game, it might just be something you already have, so you'll just get money for it. You get so much money that it becomes useless. Like, I ended up, after this footage, buying like 100 of those consumable potions because I had nothing else to spend the money on. Just the overall weaponry just isn't that interesting. The equipment is few and far between, and I just find myself being really bored, and I don't know if I want to go back to it. Hell, the only reason I played it for as long as I did was because I was playing it with one of my mates, and we very rarely get an opportunity to actually do anything like this, so we both ended up buying it, and I just ended up being disappointed in it, because it's just a basic looter shooter with a little bit of Dark Souls in it, instead of, like, something that truly feels inspired by, you know, things like that to be its own thing. Is just another generic looter shooter. It's got the Destiny problem. I played way too much of Destiny to put any more time into this, because this game has the exact same problems. It's got shit I don't care about. Like, even Destiny has better loot than this game, to be perfectly honest with you. Not to mention a bunch of the other things going on, like these annoying enemies that just spawn in all the time and really distract you from the proper boss fight. The things like, you know, not being able to sprint in the home base and just not getting any guns that I actually like outside of the stuff you start with. It's just... I'm just disappointed. And again, I don't know if this is bad luck because, like, as I said before, it's proc-gen and it can even determine what bosses you see, but considering that me and my mate actually played through and we got like the same first 3 bosses on both of our save games, I don't know how much that truly matters in the grand scheme of things. And even then, if I was looking for something better than this sniper rifle or the hunting rifle I'm eventually going to pull out in this footage, I just find myself thinking, could they have done this better? Could they have given me like more guns? Could they have like made it so that I have better loot going on? Could they have given me like a better boss like progression? Because there were a couple of bosses that were so easy I just steamrolled them, and there were a couple of bosses that were so annoying I had to bang my head against the wall 10 or 15 times, and eventually just at the end I got a reward out of them that I just didn't want. And considering that boss rewards in this game are really the only way to get rewards that you want in, like, most situations, I just find myself not being interested. I gave the game way longer than I usually give games like this to impress me, and it doesn't seem to be able to pick up the pace. It doesn't seem to be able to give me anything really particularly interesting to do. And that's just the most disappointing thing of all. It feels average at best. I'm just not particularly interested in what it has to say, what it has to do, and what it has to reward me with when I do the things that it says and does. And for a looter shooter, that's a really bad thing. Like, honestly, that's the worst thing imaginable. I'm gonna leave this footage going, but I'm gonna warn you, the boss fight that we fight at the end, the Harrow, for half an hour, we don't beat it. We lose to it every single time. And I say we because I left my game open to friends only, and the guy I was playing with joined back on, and he was wondering, what the hell are you doing? Like, but yes, we tried beating it. After a while, I might, like, cut out a bit of the footage so this video doesn't go for like an hour and 10 minutes, so that we go to the multiplayer side of things faster, so you can see how that works. But yeah, even after we cut the footage, it still took us like a good 30 minutes to beat him, so you'll be grateful that I cut a lot of the footage out. But yeah, would I recommend Remnant? Not really. I find it really hard to be interested in anything the game has to offer me. And again, looter shooter. Really bad idea, looter shooter, to not have anything particularly interesting going for you. I try to mount over this bloody wall there, but it's just not doing anything for me, and I die. Again, the audio is going to be so far out of sync at this point that you have no idea what I'm looking at, but... well, there you go. This has been Blue Maxima, and I will see you all next time.
Look out! We got company! Look out! Watch my back!